blank sheet for today, mozzarella. I wrote 16 liters on there. It's closer to 17.
16 or 17.
I'm gonna call it 17, which is the same amount of milk we had yesterday, just to kind of keep things consistently. I say we do the same amount of starter culture. So what would be 1% of 17 liters? 170, right. It's the same as what we did yesterday. 17 or 1% of 17 liters is 170 milliliters. So again, I always recommend the mason jars with the measurements on the side where you can see milliliters. Shake up the jar. You tasted it, you know it's a little bit sour. A little bit sour, a little bit yeasty. There's 170. And the milk has dropped down below 90, so we'll bring it back up above 90. 90 is the number you'll see in a lot of cheese recipes, and I like that. And I kind of assume that if I start at 93, that I'll drop down to about 90 by the time I'm cutting. So like you add the rennet, you turn the heat off, and it sits there for half an hour to an hour, and you'll usually lose a few degrees. Maybe we won't with our weather, but it is a good idea to pick a temperature and stick with it. And I'll give you a nice thing to write down. The activity of rennet is temperature dependent. The higher the temperature, the more coagulation you get, or the faster the coagulation goes. And the lower the temperature, the slower the coagulation goes. The activity of rennet is also dependent on acidity. So the more sour your milk is, the faster it coagulates. Which means that when we do our rennet test, to see how much rennet we need to use, we always want to add the starter culture first. You want to make everything the same as it would be when you're making cheese. Just by adding that 170 milliliters of our sour milk, we've altered the pH of this, just ever so slightly. What I would actually, a better way of doing this so that you can keep the milk warm is to have a pot inside a larger pot with a water bath in between. And then you could have that water bath. So you could still do 93, but it's sitting in a bath of 93 water. So it stays warmer. You also have a much less risk of like scalding the bottom of the pot. And we're up to 93. So I'll move it off the heat. Okay, so let's determine how much rennet we want to use. Yesterday, it took 5 minutes to flocculate when we added a rate of 0.3 milliliters per liter. So I say today we drop it down to 0.2, which will get us closer to 10 minutes. And this is just us kind of fine tuning the amount of rennet that we want to use. I kind of set myself up with a difficult situation by coming to people's farms and just making cheese without really knowing what the milk is going to do. This is a good thing to do, and you usually only have to get it figured out like once. Once you have the amount dialed, you're good to go until the milk starts changing seasonally. So we have 17 liters, and our factor to multiply by is 0.2. And this is one reason why I can't just give you a straightforward recipe for doing this, is because the rennet that you get might be a different strength. Even this rennet will slowly lose its strength. So a cheese recipe shouldn't tell you to use a certain amount of rennet. It should tell you to use enough to get a 10 to 15 minute flocculation. Unfortunately, most cheese recipes don't go into this sort of detail. So there is 3 mils. And he said this is like over a year old, so it probably has degraded slowly in the refrigerator. So there's 3 and then 0.4. Again, we have to get the amount right. So I'll start my timer. And my timer was actually still running from yesterday, and we are just at 24 hours now. Which is good. We're making cheese like in a consistent manner. Again, it's that daily repetition that really works best for so many fermentations. So I'll get my magic wand in. And today I want us to really pay attention so we can catch the moment when it reaches flocculation. So we're gonna put the cap on there and we're gonna watch how long it takes to reach that flocculation. I imagine it'll be longer than 5 minutes today since we adjusted our amount. Yeah, it'll be closer to 10. I'd say it'll be like 7 to 8 minutes. So we are at 11:24. Rennet. I'll start the timer. I think I might have seen some little chunks of clabber in there too. So get it moving, really stir in our starter, meaning that our fermentation has begun and now our coagulation will begin as well. Start the timer, drop it all in, and really stir vigorously up and down, moving every corner of the pot. And so that's what we're going to do about every minute or so. We just reach in and spin the cap. I like this method because some cheesemakers use a spoon and they kind of dip it in there, but you're actually breaking the surface when you do that. So you'll get like, when it does coagulate, you'll get this little spot where you can see that you broke and whey is coming out. Looks like there's a little bit of motion, but not much. It's like slowly spinning that way. I'll just do like a little. It might pay to have a bigger paddle for doing this that has like a wider plane that you could adjust. Again, a lot of these things, I don't know how important they actually are. Every cheesemaker has these like highly idiosyncratic things they do, and some cheesemakers don't do it at all. But I think it is a good idea to still your milk and just to have the philosophy of once the rennet is in, it's like you're just leaving it alone. So that's the other thing I want to think about it. Do I need the pot to be up here when we make cheese, or can it be down there? I think I am going to apply a little bit of heat, so we'll just leave it here on the stove. And so like the way that I do it isn't necessarily the way. There's a lot of techniques. And I don't want to tell anyone that what they're doing is wrong if it's giving them the cheese they want. My method is just a combination of the things I've seen and what works for me. Also, sometimes you can just look at the milk and see that it's still moving. Like I noticed the cap stopped moving, so someone give it a little spin and see if it's still doing it. It's like moving freely across the surface of the milk. But eventually it will slow down, and you'll actually, if you look closely, you'll see the milk kind of like grabbing around the edge and spinning with it. Yeah, and then we know we're getting really close. So we're coming on 5 minutes, and I expect it to be somewhere between 7 and 8. We're not going to make a lactic cheese. I teach the lactic cheese during winter when it's a more conducive environment for a lactic cheese. But it's a cheese where you would add the culture at the same rate, and you add a really small dose of rennet, like 1/4 to 1/10 of the amount we used, and you leave it overnight to coagulate. So if you ever are making a rennet curd, it takes over half an hour to flocculate, you could just leave it till the next day and turn it into a lactic cheese instead. I wouldn't call it yet, but you can see that it's close, right? So keep spinning it. You see how dramatic that was? It was within
Yeah.
about 1 minute that it was there.
Oh yeah.
And it's up to you when you make the actual call, but that's it.
That's it. It's not spinning.
It's not spinning. And if you want to see what it looks like, it's not liquid. You see that? It's like, it's got a thickness to it.
Yeah.
So that happened, like it's a dramatic transformation. So a 10-minute flock, we can expect to cut at 30 minutes. And so what I do is I like write on my sheet what time that would be, 11:55. We added the rennet at 11:24. So you're just always keeping track of that, but I always like make sure that number's visible because I'm always going to go away and do something else, you know. It's just my nature. And so we've been making, you know, the amount of clabber that we need for each day's cheese. We really don't need to make a whole jar full. We could have made less because we're only using 170 milliliters. So again, you can make as much or as little as you need. If you're just maintaining the clabber and you're not making cheese, you can just make a small 100 milliliter jar. If I was going to be making a really large batch, I'd need to use like a whole pint or even a half gallon so that I have enough that I would have 1% of whatever volume of milk I was using to make cheese. So we'll follow the same process as yesterday with this cheese. We're just going to give it a little bit of heat and make it a little bit more firm than we did yesterday.
So far, everything's the exact. Other than the
Yeah.
flavor of it.
Yeah, and we're gonna do, I think, the exact same thing on every day, making all of these cheeses. We'll just have slight variations in the texture of the cheese when it comes out. And then where it's really going to deviate today is the form we're going to put it in. We don't need to make a bunch of little cheeses. We're just going to make one really big cheese. Or like one really big one and some smaller ones. Again, the form that we're putting them into is just to get the cheese to the right level of acidity, and then we will cut the whole thing up and process it into its final shape by stretching. So for mozzarella and these stretched curd cheeses, it's kind of ideal to have all the cheeses be the same size. If we have a really small one and a really big one, they're gonna ferment at different rates. The small one will cool faster and the big one will stay hotter and it will have more fermentation. Yeah, I think we're getting there. So I can push down significantly and it just gives, even like leaves an imprint of my hand. My hand comes away clean and I'm pulling it away from the edge. It looks pretty clean to me. So does somebody want to try doing the clean break test?
Sam, it's all you.
So just make an incision in the center, a fairly long one. And then go at an angle. But start like right here so that you're going to lift up on the cut you already began. Yep, now lift up. Yeah, I'd say that's ready. Somebody else want to do it from a different side? It's okay, like at this point, it's just practice. There's a resistance, like you have to lift up pretty hard to get it to go. Yeah, it looks pretty clean on the inside. But you usually want to start like somewhere more in the middle so you have enough space to go towards the edge. So I'll do the first cut and I'll let you guys do the second cuts. And then I'll do like the first line, and so just follow this line that I'm making here. And everyone can do like 2 of these this time.
Straight.
Yep. You got it. Keep it straight in contact with the pot the whole time. Perfect. So somehow it's a little bit different, the curd today. It felt, I don't know, it felt better today for some reason. And yesterday, you remember we waited a long time, like we waited a lot longer than our estimated time.
Cut the curd.
Yeah. So some of the variables could be the fact that like we're getting milk just from like a few cows, and maybe it was different cows yesterday than today.
Yeah.
And their milk is a little bit different. So the milk just coagulates a little differently. And so I am doing more cuts today, so hopefully we can get a smaller curd initially. Because we had like just really big pieces yesterday.
And we didn't go all the way through the other way, I think, did we?
I think we did.
Yeah, like as much as we can. There's always spots that you miss. So that's where you have to use your hand to do this.
But it will be drier, like if you did just go in and break it all up a lot.
Yeah, you'd end up with much smaller curds and a drier cheese. And I want a high moisture mozzarella. I want that juicy. And we're gonna lose a lot of moisture as it drains and ferments. There's another way of doing this where you actually leave the cheese in the whey and it goes a bit faster because of that. And probably when you guys are stirring, you're gonna break the curd and you'll see that. You'll just see more milkiness in the whey. It's fine. The only way to know where the edge is to go over it. And this feels a bit softer than yesterday, so I'm gonna be more delicate with these initial stirs. Just get my hand in and just twist, and I'm like on the bottom, just like kind of pulling the corner in, but not dragging it all the way up to the top yet. Yeah, go to the bottom and just give it a little twist.
And then up.
Yep,
Like that much?
yep, perfect. And then move your hand over and do it in another section. And then most importantly, pick one of those up and eat it. And you can see I'm going a little bit faster now because I'm feeling that it's firming up. I know I can. So we can actually bring all the way up from the bottom like that.
So it's really those corners.
Yeah, the
You can't
corner.
get the angle.
Exactly. That's the hardest spot to get.
That's what you really want to move up to.
Yep. You're trying to find where those big ones are and bring them up to the surface so you can cut them. It almost seems sweeter than the milk does itself. I'm not really sure why exactly, but. And then I'm going to put it onto the heat and we'll start cooking a little bit. Once the heat's on, you really have to keep it moving because you don't want any of the curds to sit on the bottom and they'll like start getting dried out.
Now this is where we diverge from yesterday.
Yeah, we're going to give it a little bit of heat just so that we can firm it up a little bit more. And so when I'm heating, I always have my hand along the bottom and I feel the heat coming through. So like my hand is feeling how much heat is coming into the pot, and I'm keeping the curd from sitting there by just running my hand along the bottom. Yeah, when you're cooking, it should be at the most like 2 degrees every 5 minutes. Especially at first, I want to really slowly introduce the heat. We'll just maybe come back up to our starting temperature of 92 or 93. So I'll do the first couple of scoops, then I'll let you guys take the rest of the curd out. You want to be pretty delicate with it, so don't like throw it in there, just kind of drop the curd in with a little bit of its whey.
Just a little bit firmer curd,
A little bit firmer.
and that'll have a little bit less moisture or
Yeah.
more?
Yeah,
A
if
little
it's
less.
firmer, then the final cheese will have less moisture in it because we're pushing the moisture out now in the pot. And then more moisture will come out as it drains and ferments. But I do want a juicy mozzarella, so I'm not pushing out a lot. If we were going for a harder cheese, we'd cut smaller, we'd stir and cook more.
And then you'd bring the temperature up more as well.
Yeah, like for like a Parmigiano, they're cooking to like 125 or something. There are cheeses that are cooked to high temperatures that don't end up that hard, like Alpine cheeses, so like Gruyere and raclette. Stuff like that are cooked to a high temperature, but they don't have as much acidity, so they don't ferment as much, and that holds in the moisture. So it's always like a combination of factors that are leading to the final texture of the cheese. And the next thing I want to move into is mozzarella stretching. So I got this water up to a boil because the curd is cold and it's going to absorb a lot of the temperature. And just like pouring it into a pot to stretch it, it will lose heat. So I start with the water at more like 200, expecting to lose 20 degrees in the process. Once it's 180, you can have your hands in for a couple seconds. And what I do to prevent myself from burning, you can wear gloves, but I also like to just have cold water. And if you keep dipping your hands in cold water, you can push it pretty far. It's like 170 to 180 it will stretch, but you want to kind of use the minimal amount of water possible, because the more water you use, the more it washes out the fat of the milk. And you'll see the water we use to stretch will take on it'll turn milky, because we are losing some fat in this process. Yeah, I start at about 200, sometimes even boiling, depending on what your situation is and what you're stretching in. And then what we're gonna do is just test a small piece of the curd to see if we're there or not. And before I do that, I wanna let you taste it so you can kind of see if you can just tell and detect signs of fermentation before we stretch. And then I'll just take a couple of scraps, pour some hot water over it, and do the final stretch test. It takes a little bit of time for the curd to heat up and to absorb the temperature of the water. So you kind of put it into some hot water, and then taking a spoon, you press it. And that's hot. That's hot enough that I can't keep my hand in it, which is what you're going for. But it's stretching so far that it doesn't even break. And that's perfect for mozzarella. The more you stretch it, the more you put it in hot water, the more rubbery it gets. So I try to use the minimal amount of water and actually stretch it as little as possible. But we know we're ready. We saw that infinite stretch. And when you tasted it before we even went to stretch it, could you tell that it was fermenting? Yeah, the indication is there. And the texture is changing. So those are the things you can look for without even doing the stretch test. The way we're gonna salt this is different than any of the other cheeses we've looked at. We're actually gonna salt the curd before we stretch it. So that in stretching, we're gonna kind of force the salt in, and the cheese will be perfectly salted immediately. So we're gonna salt the curd, dry salt it in a bowl, so I'm gonna weigh it. And when you chop this up, in order to do the stretching, you wanna get it pretty small so that you don't have huge pieces of cheese that would take a long time to melt. You want them kind of like maximum that size. So you cut them up, you weigh them, and then we'll add salt at 4%. Which would be, it's way too much salt if we were just gonna eat this. 4% is twice as much as we want in the cheese, and in finished cheese you want, I'd say a maximum of 2%. Unless it's feta. Feta is maybe more like 2.5, but the general rule of thumb is 1.5 to 2% salt in a finished cheese. And that's true with a lot of ferments. I think it's basically true with food in general. So we're chopping everything up, weighing it, and then adding salt at 4%. But to do the salt, I'll just multiply 2,000 by 0.04. 80, so I need 80 grams of salt. This is a cheese that it is definitely more involved than anything else we're making. It requires more steps, but the reward is great. So there's 80 grams. Throw it on, and stir it in. And there's this really cool thing that happens when you salt fresh curd like this. It emits this aroma that I find really pleasant. So we know we're ready to stretch. And I wouldn't leave it for too long before you do this because it's absorbing the salt, and we actually don't want that much salt in our finished cheese. So we're just continue to stir it in to get the salt evenly distributed. And then I have like my setup here. I got my cold water, my hot water, and my curd. Preheated my vessel. And I'll get my thermometer so we can see what temperature the curds are at. So what I'll do is drop some curd into this, enough to make a rather large mozzarella ball thing. And then I'll pour hot water over it. Just a little bit on that first round, just enough to cover the curds. It's softening up from that hot water.
Even at that low temp.
Yeah, even at that low temp. It's not much, but you see it's like becoming a little more pliable.
Yeah.
And you can see stretching starting to happen when I push the spoon in. There's like stringiness in the curd. And you're giving it time so that the whole thing gets warm enough so that we'll have even stretching. And then I'm going to take this into my hand. I'm going to make it into a ball. So there it is, stretching cheese. And then if we were just going to make a ball of mozzarella, what I would do is kind of bring it all together and make it smooth like a dough ball.
That's all the stretching you do.
Yeah, that's all the stretching that I do. And then you, like for a straight up fresh mozzarella, you just seal up the bottom, kind of like that. But what I usually do is bring it together into something that I can like tie a rope around like that. Okay, so I'll hand this to you so that you can play with it. And I'll just pinch off a little ball like that and just grab it, rip it off. And this is, by the way, what I'm doing is how people oftentimes stretch mozzarella in Italy. Yeah, and that's the right way to eat it, is to pull it apart, you know, maximize the surface area. It's good, right? It's like, this is my favorite cheese in the workshop, always. Can you guys detect that maltiness? Right? I only see it.
What's the difference from this to this?
It's more pronounced because of the hot water. The hot water just brings that flavor forward. Okay, so this is all one big mass. And this is going to be the photogenic moment. This is the most theatrical cheese I know of. You can just touch it for a couple of seconds at a time. And you switch back and forth. So I would be like getting this hand cold and then getting that hand cold.
Ta-da!
It's fun. I can't wait to actually go to Oaxaca and see how like the abuelas do this, you know, because they get it super long. And so this will be a little bit drier than the next version that we're gonna make. There it is.
Wow.
So you can see that hot water kind of melted it all together. If you're gonna store mozzarella that way to keep it like nice and juicy, you make a brine out of whey and you store it in that brine. So that's mozzarella.